Hey everybody, and welcome back to Time Extend. It's been a while. How you doing, Brendan?
Yeah, pretty good, Adam. Looking forward to discussing some of the latest news, but really it'll be the feature topic this week that we'll really be wanting to get stuck into, I guess.
Yeah, and I blew right past the introduction, and we're not as famous as we think we are. So Time Extend is a racing game podcast. My name's Adam, his name is Brendan, and that's really all you need to know, I guess. So, yeah. Let's get into it. There's been some news over the last month or so since we had our last show. Not a lot of huge announcements or anything like that, but I think a good place to start is that Gran Turismo Sport had their first big events in the form of they had their European Championship and the American Championship is right around the corner, and then they just announced that they were going to have the World Final in Monaco. And I didn't watch a ton of these events, but from what I heard, everything went really smoothly. And while it's not getting a ton of mainstream recognition, I would say at this point, I think the people who paid attention and just seeing like the social media interest from people who are fans of sim racing and also Sony's own promotion of the event seemed pretty high, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. We're looking at the first year of the championship, and it's quite impressive how it's all went off without a hitch, because you're expecting to hear some horror stories at least, but the American finals were in Las Vegas, for example. That's a pretty high regard place to host an event like this when it doesn't really have a built-up audience yet. But yeah, it's good to see GT Sport realise its FIA ambitions, and hell, the World Finals are going to be hosted in Monte Carlo, and it doesn't get more lucrative than that.
Yeah, and the way things have been going so far, where they've hosted the events has pretty much directly resulted in some extra tracks added to the list of tracks in the game. So we know now that we're going to Catalunya because that debuted during the European event, and we. Based on a Forbes article that I saw somebody in the GT Planet community linked to, it strongly looks like we probably get Monaco. If they're going to Monaco as it is to do this event, it only makes sense. And I think I saw Laguna Seca name dropped as well, which Laguna Seca actually is the one I'd be really excited for because obviously classic Gran Turismo track. We've been playing Gran Turismo for years. Its absence in GT Sport was one that I definitely felt, and it's just such a fun little, relatively short track, but packs a lot of excitement and a lot of really amazing corners. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, definitely. It would be great additions to the game, and more than ever I feel myself wanting to get fully invested into the sport mode, purely because when you see this type of thing take off, it does make you more interested on what GT Sport offers in that mode. The competitive racing is probably the best in its class, or I'd go as far to say it is the best in its class. And now we're seeing the drivers who are the very top get the rewards and competing in these tournaments. And I'm checking like a review article from Jordan Greer over at GT Planet, and he's commenting on how all the drivers were treated to staying in a luxury 5-star hotel, got all their meals paid for, and they even had a crazy party after the whole shindig with Kazunori Yamauchi himself.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine what Kaz is like in the party setting, and I don't think I can even comprehend it, so I'm not going to make any assumptions. But, it's, all of those points, just the treatment of the drivers and everything brings up something I saw this week that I actually saw a lot of people commenting on. And I don't know if you saw this, but Maurizio Rivabene, the guy who runs basically Ferrari's F1 team, Scuderia Ferrari, they were talking to him about, basically it was Motorsport Week, they were talking to him about what he needs to, or what F1 needs to do to basically survive in this age of, not just in the context of other racing series to get more fans, but also in this digital age where there's so many different forms of entertainment. And I mean, Rivabene, it seems like without skipping a beat, he just pretty much says like, I don't think that our opponent F1's competition is other racing or other real or not real, but traditional sports, I think it's PlayStation and I think it's Gran Turismo. And he actually did say those names specifically. And I mean, when I read that, we have this view of Ferrari as a very traditional, by-the-book company. The idea of the boss of Ferrari recognizing these new forms of media and treating sim racing and esports as a legitimate competitor to Formula One, I was blown away, and I was very impressed.
Yeah, and if we're going to be honest, he's probably right in terms of what Sony and Polyphony have achieved so far. It is impressive. It's still very early days, and they've covered the event incredibly well, but maybe not had the audience response they were looking for. But you plant that seed in people's minds, in this case the boss of Ferrari, for God's sake, and it starts to get brought up. So who knows, perhaps we might see some real works teams and not simply just like the manufacturers in the game being represented. We see it in the Formula 1 series, for example, where all the esports teams are pretty much real Formula 1 teams, and perhaps Ferrari might actually start to take notice of what's going on in the GT Sport Championships and what they can do to get involved.
Yeah, and when you look at GT Sports, the focus obviously on on like real manufacturers and locations and basically people's countries of origins and things like that. It makes sense. GT Sport is well suited for that. But this was the first real wave of Gran Turismo events, and I was just wondering, because you've been following the Rocket League Championships for a while, and I know you had said a while back, you told me that you had gone to the World Final when it was hosted in the UK. And obviously Rocket League is at, the upper plane of esports right now. Is like, I feel like it's Rocket League, Fortnite, and I guess Overwatch 2. But, this kind of stuff doesn't happen overnight. And I was just wondering if there was any way that you could compare, like, Rocket League and its earliest attempts at doing this esports thing, doing these tournaments, to what, Sony and Polyphony have done with Gran Turismo so far.
Well, I mean, right out the bat, I would say that Gran Turismo is pretty much like on an entirely different plane to what Psyonix achieved with the Rocket League Championship Series in their first year. For example, these kind of regional championships that Gran Turismo have had like double the capacity in terms of attendees that the first Rocket League Championship Series has.
Wow.
But I mean, we also have to bear in mind here that we're talking about one of the biggest gaming conglomerates in the world backing something, and then on the other side, some, at the time, small indie title that nobody expected to blow up like it has. But the thing is here that Rocket League was able to build an audience that properly, religiously watched every esports series, not even just the Championship Series, which is the equivalent of the Super Bowl for Americans and the Champions League for us in Europe. Like, there's a good dedicated fan base there that knows the players, knows their quirks, and this is the thing for Sony and Gran Turismo going forward. Getting people to these events is great, and by linking it in with car shows and that type of thing, that's fantastic. You're going to get people there, but at that point in time, and this might be a bit harsh, you can consider that tourist income, basically. It's just people going to watch the event because it's there. Where Gran Turismo needs to thrive is getting that audience that consistently watches the drivers. They know their quirks, they understand like what's going on, and even have favourites, because let's be honest, if you watch sports you have a favourite team, and Formula 1's no different in the sense that people have favourite drivers. So I'd like to think that once we get this first year done, and I just can't wait to see the mainstream media's reaction when a video game player gets to get a real trophy at an FIA event. And I think that's when people go, wow, this is serious. This guy is literally being honoured by the biggest motorsport officiating body in the world. And yeah, I think right now Gran Turismo's off to an amazing start because they've had that backing from Sony and they've took feedback on board. I mean, just as a minor point, I remember when I watched the very first championships, they didn't actually have the driver names. They just had the manufacturer names above the cars, and that annoyed me to no end because it totally
I think I remember that.
Element. Yeah, it was really stupid at the time, and I can see the logic for it. And let's be honest, this is an entirely new kind of foray into the esports realm, so it's understandable. But they've took that advice on board. When you're watching these events now, you can tell who's who, and that is very important, because that's what made the Rocket League Championship Series so big. There's guys that can do amazing things, and because you can instantly recognise them on the field, then that's what keeps you interested and keeps you watching. So I'd say in terms of events and organisations, Gran Turismo was arguably achieving what took Rocket League 7 years, and now it's just a case of how do you build that audience and keep people interested once the novelty wears off.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what you said. You'd expect that Sony would be able to do this pretty well right out of the gate because they're freaking Sony. So it's good that they have. But yeah, I think the human drama, obviously Kaz, when he introduced Gran Turismo Sport, talked about human drama and what that could mean for the series and for gaming and for entertainment and everything. And I think it's hard to achieve that. I mean, it's directly related to, as a direct relationship with the success of the game, right? So I mean, everyone knows, well, not everyone, because I don't watch Fortnite streamers and esports and stuff like that, but I have a feeling that people who are really into Fortnite know their guys, know their guys and girls in terms of who they like to watch, who's competitive, who they're fans of. I keep hearing this Ninja guy a lot about him. He knows Drake or something. So yeah, that's a big deal, and it's interesting because in the last over the last 6 months, Lydia, my girlfriend, just randomly got really interested in Formula One. And I mean, we had watched some races early on in the season, and I didn't want to make her sit through anything because I didn't know how. I assumed it wasn't very interesting to her, but I guess she got bitten by the bug or something like that because she liked it, and she's just been obsessed with it, honestly, over the last few months. It's really great because it's something we can both enjoy, and honestly, her fandom for F1 exceeds mine right now. But when we talk about it, it's, I mean, she enjoys the racing and she likes watching it, and this is someone who wasn't interested in racing at all before, but for her, I think it is the drama between the drivers, the teams, the context of everything, all of that, and that goes along with a quote I read on Reddit the other day that was basically like, F1 is just like soap operas for dudes, right? So yeah, just some kind of masculine, play or opera or something like that. So yeah, like I think all of that is essential to why we enjoy sports, and I feel like it's a really tough thing to achieve that with a video game, but evidently if you have the kind of game that is widely accessible, like a Rocket League or, like a Fortnite or an Overwatch or something like that, then that's easier to do. So yeah, I don't know how Gran Turismo competes with that, but like you were saying, it was their first real attempt. I mean, they had done other, smaller tournaments and things before that, but nothing on this scale. And I think it was a promising one overall, by the sound of it.
Yeah, definitely. And just to kind of bring it back into that human element, it doesn't necessarily even have to do with the game. Like we're saying, it's the competitors, much like Formula One, because there's a pretty funny story that I'll just briefly go into in the Rocket League community that happened. So basically, one of the best players in the world was playing in his team against one of the lesser teams in the league play phase before the playoffs, and essentially what happened was the series actually ended 3-2 because it's a best of 5, and most people were really shocked by that. And then the guy tweeted out on his Twitter account, should have been 3-0 but GG anyway, and it was like that level of salt that would then, like, the fans just lost their nut because it was like, so funny to see like somebody be so like petty and salty about still winning the match. So when we were at the World Championship finals, there were so many people holding up signs and banners that just said, should have been 3-0 but GG anyway, anytime like a series ended. And like that was a whole season, like 3 months of constant bants about that one moment. And that's what I'd like to see. Like, these guys are racing and they're getting interviewed afterwards, and look, I know it's hard to be charismatic, especially when, I mean, all you're doing is playing a video game at the end of the day, but there's so many things you can do. Like, for example, the Australian Rocket League community don't get as many views as the EU and America's ones. Mm-hmm. But like one of the guys, CJ, who plays for the Chiefs, I believe it is, when they do their walkout to come onto the stage to play, he came out like a tiny BMW, like electric car. He just kind of
awesome.
Drove up to the stage, and like that was it. Like, from that moment on, the entire crowd was endeared with his team, and they had the backing of like 3,500 people for the entire tournament. Essentially, even when they get put out, people were still chanting his team's name because like the fans just got on board with it, and that's the goal Sony and Gran Turismo have to try and achieve. Make people care about these people. They're treating them fantastically internally. Get them the exposure they deserve outside of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm excited for the future, and in terms of other things we can talk about, you've been pretty interested in a little game called Grip, as I understand it, which I really should know more about, but I don't.
So I'll give you a quick TLDR then. Basically, Grip is a game by Caged Element, who were started by one guy who really liked the series Roll Cage, PlayStation 1. He was a huge fan of the game and often wondered why there was never any new ones. Obviously, it was Psygnosis that were behind the game, and Sony kind of left it. Well, sorry, it wasn't even Sony, it was involved. It was Psygnosis on their own, because it was on the PC as well.
Wow.
And it was pretty popular. People who liked Wipeout, especially over here, loved it. And it was great fun, but it just kind of disappeared in the gaming sands of time, as some series do. So this guy was like, you know what, I'm going to start my own fan project, try and get this off of the ground. Cut 3-4 years later, the game got an official distributor. It's made by a team of about 14 people now, and they've done what I consider the impossible. They're going to have a full simultaneous worldwide launch on every console, including the Switch, next week for Grip. And that is so impressive for me as someone who has watched how poorly Formula Fusion was handled by the ex-Wipeout developers. That's one of the reasons I'm so excited for Grip, because these guys had a goal and they managed to attain it. And this is bearing in mind they had a failed Kickstarter as well, and we're still going to get a finished game. It's very impressive, and I can't wait to give it a go.
So we'll come back to Grip. I don't mean to change the subject too much, but I wondered, and I tried to look it up recently, whatever happened to Formula Fusion, because I was so psyched about that game.
I mean, I'm glad that you actually want to talk about this one, because it's something that all 12 remaining Wipeout fans in the world are also wondering, and that there just isn't any official news. They came out the gate with this really impressive concept trailer. They appeared at some game shows with real gameplay footage, and it just kind of disappeared.
Well, from what I understand, it had a full release, but the full release was with like no content, and was very buggy and had a lot of problems, and they haven't fixed that at all. And I think if it was any other fan, quote unquote fan game, I know it was made by some ex-Wipeout devs, but if it was any other indie project, then you'd say like, okay, whatever. But the reason why that one particularly stung for me is because I had the full involvement of the Designers Republic, which, as any Wipeout fan knows, is the reason why, the first 3 Wipeout games especially look and feel the way that they do, is this graphic design firm from the UK. So, yeah, I mean, to get them on board and then to completely squander the project like that just seems criminal.
See, the thing was with this game, I was always pretty weary of what they proposed, because they went into so much detail about the fact that you could customise your ships and tweak weaponry and all this type of thing, and I don't know about you, Adam, but that just seemed to derive from what made Wipeout so great in the first place. It felt like an unnecessary expansion of the gameplay, and then they talked about how much they wanted to make the gameplay also kind of more weighty than Wipeout, and just even from gameplay footage, it just didn't seem to have that Wipeout feel. It just seemed like another kind of 2-bit anti-gravity racer, and that's what was unfortunate about Formula Fusion. The devs promised it would reach consoles, and it's definitely not happening now, is it? It's a shame how it ended up, and you're right about the scarcity of content. That's what shocked everyone else, because they kept talking about these lofty customization options, and then the game itself was barely a beta.
Yeah, it just seems like a mismatch priorities, basically. Because at the end of the day, you can set your sights for, eventually coming out with some sort of customization component to a game. I don't think anyone would complain about that, but make sure you get the core of the game finished first and make sure there are enough tracks and teams and other forms of content to bide people's time. If you have a kind of a half-assed customization component, but the rest of the game isn't sound, no one's going to care. It's surprising to me because, obviously it was developed by the original, some of the original team. But, well, I'll shed a tear for Formula Fusion. But we got Grip, so that's exciting. And I never played Roll Cage, weirdly enough. Was it a series or was there only one?
There was actually a series. Most notably Stage 2, the second game in the series being considered the best, and it seems to be a strange one because over here, it's a very well-known series and it was hailed pretty well, but I mean, was that not the case in America then? Was it much different? Was it just Wipeout that was kind of more well-known?
Yeah, I would say Wipeout was the most well-known. I mean, I feel like I always have to introduce this caveat every time we talk about really old games where it's like, yeah, I wasn't aware of everything that was going on in the world when I was fucking 7 or 8 or 9 or however old I was. But no, I can just say that among people in the US, I think Wipeout was if you're gonna talk about the most distinctly British games, I guess, to make it all across the world, in get that mainstream recognition, I feel like Wipeout was one of them. It was born out of the British music scene, the club music scene, involved a British design house, obviously, was made by a British team. So that was very much a love letter to and from the UK. And I don't know how Roll Cage was, but I think Wipeout seemed almost over here, it was successful, but I think it was almost this weird European thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved it. It's one of my favorite game series of all time, obviously. But yeah, so I think Wipeout kind of had that, both playing to its quirkiness and against its success in the US. But yeah, I don't know anything about how Roll Cage, I don't hear about as much, so I doubt it.
So basically, if Wipeout was a love letter to the entire kind of UK dance house industry, and that's where it was born from, Roll Cage was very much drum and bass. That also had an incredible soundtrack that included the likes of some original tracks from Fatboy Slim, and just in general a really great soundtrack. And even the track design and stuff, it's more focused on that chaotic element of flipping upside down constantly, driving on the roofs. It was more intense than Wipeout, but it had the totally different angle of having really heavy vehicles. It was almost like controlling tanks with a fucking rocket launcher on the back. So it is completely different feel to Wipeout, but very much in the same universe. It honestly feels like a spin-off more than anything. And funnily enough, I've just looked it up now, and apparently outside of Europe it was known as Death Track Racing as well. Not sure if that rings a bell.
No, I think it was Roll Cage here. I'm pretty sure it was.
Right, okay.
But
that must have been other locations then.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting that Pygnosis worked on this other racing property and it didn't get Sony's backing, so it wasn't. I think for the longest time I assumed it was a PC-only title. But I think maybe in the US that might be where a lot of people experienced it. So, yeah, it's cool. I'll definitely give Grip a try. It's very nice to hear a successful story about, an independent game that really harkens back to something we love, because I've just been inundated between Formula Fusion and all these other titles. I was really excited for a while about the 90s Arcade Racer. Did you ever hear about that one? Yeah. So, I even backed it. That was the first game I ever backed, the first thing I ever backed, and it was just a complete money pit, and is never coming out. Was never particularly interested in Drift Stage, because Drift Stage goes back to, even though it has a 32-bit style, it goes back to really 16-bit racing games, which is something that is a little before my time. I don't have much of an interest in. But that seems to be another case where, not as bad as perhaps this Formula Fusion, because it seems like they really do have a game running, and it's been I think it's been like a green light thing, and you've been able to get demos of it. But that game too is also in this place where it's like they're putting out a lot of content in terms of like videos and, you know, GIFs of various things in the game and the soundtrack, but the game isn't out yet, and it's been that way for like 4 years, it seems like.
Yeah, it's a story all too well told across the board.
Yeah.
But racing games in particular are like, I guess it's a bit of blind optimism on our part, because even with Grip, which does see the release, which is fantastic, it does look incredibly cheap, and that is the thing. Like, they obviously got it to a position where they were happy enough with the gameplay and how it was to send it out there, knowing that they could make the most polished roll cage spiritual successor in the world and still only sell 12 copies. This was pretty much a labour of love from the start, and they've achieved their goal of getting it on every console. And I mean, that's the thing, I'm simultaneously excited about it launching on the Switch, but also incredibly weary judging on some early gameplay footage I've seen.
Yeah. Well, next show we'll have a full report, and maybe I'll play some of it too. And
yep, definitely.
hopefully we'll be pleasantly surprised.
For sure.
Yeah. So speaking of games we're looking forward to that look incredibly weary, Team Sonic Racing. So it got delayed since the last time we had our show, from December to May 21st, 2019, which is, I mean, you can delay a game, but Jesus Christ, 6 months. I mean, that is tough, especially because, like, you know, we were talking about this game after it was announced at E3, and we were already kind of skeptical of it, because it seemed to be one of those cases where it's like, okay, Sumo Digital is making a Sonic racing game. This has worked so many times in the past, but it seems like they deliberately, well, not they, probably Sega, but deliberately tried to unlearn all of the lessons and forget all of the great things about Transformed, which was definitely the height of all of Sumo's efforts related to Sega. That was a fantastic game. Not just a great racing game or a kart racer, but just a great game all around. You know, the gameplay itself was fantastic, but the track design was impeccable. The soundtrack was great. Tons of fan service for Sega fans. And then I guess Sega decides, like, we want to basically scrap all of that, take this back to being a Sonic racer, which, like, even Sonic All-Star, you know, the first one, you know, had Sega content in it. Just get rid of all of it and then start over with, as someone at my job, a Tom's Guide, noted to me a couple months back, they're using the animations from the first game, not even the second one, when they do tricks and things. Yeah, so there are a lot of things to be unsure about, and that have me kind of concerned about this game. And now that it's been delayed in there 6 months, it's not looking good.
I mean, in all honesty, I just think it looks, quite frankly, really boring. Any gameplay footage that I've seen so far, it just looks so slow and methodical, whereas Transform's biggest positive was how insanely fast everything was, especially when you reached the S speed class. That was insane.
Yeah.
But this one, I'm not quite sure what they're trying to achieve. The excitement of the race doesn't seem there, but they seem to have really kind of sound team racing mechanics that I wouldn't have minded in Transformed, but the way the game plays and their obsession with showing like 2 tracks so far, I mean, it's not a surprise that it got delayed, but to get delayed to this extent shows that maybe, just maybe, they've realised that it was a bit of a disaster waiting to happen. And with Sumo's fairly good record overall working with Sega, I'm happy to see the delay. But the thing that really worries me the most is I just don't think that only Sonic characters is going to have that pull, regardless of what they pull off. That
no, absolutely not.
Had.
Because I'm a Sonic fan and I don't even give a shit. Like that's the problem. And obviously I know you are too. But yeah, I can't help thinking, like, as I think about the fact that they're launching this new Sonic racing game that cribs lots of things from older games, except for a team element, but also loses a lot of things, I can't help but wonder, why didn't they just go the route of basically porting Transform to the Switch, but doing it in like a Mario Kart 8 Deluxe way, where they add content to it? Because we know we know that Transform could run on the Switch because it ran on the freaking Vita. So
Yeah.
it would not be hard for them to port that game. I mean, every port takes time, but I think that would be among the easier ones. And if they add content to it, I mean, you could sell that as a new game. Sega did it with Sonic Mania Plus, and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was a similar fashion. So, and people love Transform. That's already a game that's been successful. I feel like that would have just made more sense than making an entirely new game that's also worse.
There was an April Fool's joke. I think it was the Sonic Stadium ran, and like it was Sonic Transform Deluxe, and it had like 3 new tracks, Bayonetta, some characters from Yakuza, Kiryu was in there, and it just sounded incredible, but maybe possible to be true because they put it out like 2 weeks ahead of April Fool's to get the jump on it, and then it was just
that's unfair. That's not even April Fool's joke.
Exactly. And
come
when
on.
the full game got announced, like the new one, because sorry, I should dial back a bit. We actually discussed the possibility of a new Sonic racing game around the time that joke went out.
Yeah.
So, like, oh my god, and like they even said like Miku would be in there as well because they obviously have the Project Diva rights, and then the full game gets announced, and it's just like, oh my word, it's the total opposite of what that rumor was, basically. And, I mean, I noticed they uploaded like one of the new music tracks on Twitter recently, and it was actually a T-Lopes that was the kind of composer for this, and he helped a lot with Sonic Mania. So that's got me interested to see if maybe they've thought about incorporating more Sonic Mania stuff in there that we don't quite know yet, but it intrigues me like 4%, put it that way. It's something that would be cool to have in there, but the core problem with this game is going to be to make me care about the kind of generic Sonic colours locations they'll probably abuse for the 14th time.
Yeah. It would be cool if they did something that was like, you know, all of these tracks and characters are in the graphical style of a certain Sonic game or something like that. That might be cool. I'm just trying to think of ways they could make it more interesting, but at the end of the day, Sega is a company with a rich history that goes well beyond Sonic, and getting rid of all of that extra content just seems like a waste. So, yeah,
it's a huge waste, and it comes in the same. Like, this discussion comes in the same week that Sega announced their own brawler like Smash Brothers, but only for mobile.
Oh yeah,
and,
that's right.
Like Sega's been taking a lot of W's recently. They've been doing great, I think, and just this Sonic Team Racing delay combined with that mobile-only fighter kind of made me a bit sad because I think there's still a market in general console, like kind of the general console audience for some Sega fan service. I don't think that ship has totally sailed, but we're a bit biased, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're so hit and miss, and the Sega Forever thing was obviously such a complete, just, you could basically call it a lie. They didn't put in any extra effort, honestly, to get these games on various different platforms, and the ports of games, the things that they were talking about Sega Forever, which, if you don't know and you're listening to this, because we should remember this is a racing game podcast, was their initiative so that they could get basically not their entire back catalog, but a lot of their back catalog on mobile platforms, which, you know, could at that point maybe extend to consoles and PC as well. Really, all they decided to do was just take the shoddy ports that have been basically kicking around for, 10 years on various different platforms, rebrand them as Sega Forever titles with that were free to play, and that was it. They didn't put any effort into. There was some talk early on about like, oh, we'll get some Saturn titles in there. No, that's never going to happen. And it's very clear. I mean, the only part of Sega that has any interest in actually honoring the past is M2, as they're working on their Virtual Racing port, which is super exciting. But that said, as we talk about M2 and Team Sonic Racing doesn't look that enthralling, we should also add that the guys that are working on the Sega Ages games, they have confirmed in an interview that they've actually been able to get Naomi hardware running through the Switch. Was it just the Switch, or was it other consoles as well?
They specifically mentioned only the Switch because I think the Ages series is only on Switch, isn't it? So they're kind of focused on that, which is great news. As somebody who we both really loved their ports to date so far. This is actually pretty big because Dreamcast can't be that far away now, and I'm guessing they've said something similar to that.
Yeah, it's great that this happened on the episode that we were already planning to do a Sega Racing System on, because it directly ties to a game that we were about to talk about. But yeah, Naomi and the Dreamcast, as we're going to talk about in the next segment, are basically intertwined. They're pretty much the same hardware. Naomi is the arcade version of it. I think there were 2 iterations as well. There was like a Naomi and Naomi 2. But yeah, so this basically means a Crazy Taxi and Ferrari F355 would be possible. I mean, Ferrari's almost assuredly not going to happen, so I won't get your hopes up for that. But Crazy Taxi, I would say, is definitely within the running for a Sega Ages kind of redone through Sega Ages kind of effort. So that's amazing. I'm really excited for that. As long as M2 gets the original music, and I'm sure they will, because they do they don't half-ass a single goddamn thing. Then
they really don't.
Then it would be really great, and that unlocks all the Dreamcast games as well. So, like I said, I'm super excited for Virtua Racing on the Switch. They announced it. Well, they didn't. They heavily teased that it was going to have some kind of multiplayer mode, online multiplayer, which, even if the only people who are playing it are me and you, Brendan, I'm still psyched for that.
Oh, definitely. The guys are just so good at what they do, and it's why any port they make interests me to a certain degree, even if it isn't a game that I hold nostalgia for or I'm not a fan of. I know they're going to do it justice, and for every 2 of us who love Virtua Racing, there's somebody that's going to love one of the other games they make that maybe isn't huge, and that's why I love that team. They just give it their all and try and make it as faithful as possible, while also adding new additions that even enhance the experience.
Absolutely, yeah. I cannot wait. And we have a couple of these Sega Ages games are already out. I think the Phantasy Star one is out, and Gain Ground, and various old Sega titles. But I'm hoping the Virtua Racing isn't too far behind. And they did 3D. They did one for the 3DS of Outrun. But unfortunately, I don't think that any of that applies to the Switch. But yeah, I just want to see more. I want to see them try out more Sega Racing games. I think it'd be super exciting once those finally drop.
Yep.
Yeah, so that ends the news portion. But yeah, like I said, don't be upset, because we're basically going to be talking about all this stuff again when we do Sega Racing System.
Exactly.
So we'll be right back. Hey, welcome back to Time Extend, and yeah, we've got a Sega Racing System for you this week. We're going to be talking about another Dreamcast racing game, and this could be none other than Ferrari F355 Challenge Passione Rossa. Rossa? How did I? Rossa, yeah.
Yep, that's good.
So yeah, this is Yu Suzuki's love letter to the Ferrari F355 car he owned, and you finally got a chance to play this recently, Brendan, and I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts about it. We weren't sure where to go with our next SRS topic, but I think this is a good one because it's a game that I feel like gets overlooked by a lot of people on both the sim. We only talk about this divide, but the sim and arcade end of the spectrum, just because like it is really technically, it is a sim racer. Like it's a full-on sim racer, but it was one that to get the full experience you could only ever play in the arcades. And it was made by Sega, which never really had that reputation. And for a long time, not a long time, but for a good year, it was exclusive to Dreamcast, a system nobody owned. And once it came out here, by that time, it looks like, September 2002, so on the PS2 was when it got re-released there. So Gran Turismo 3 was already out. So it just has this kind of weird history of being in every place at the wrong time, which is unfortunate because it's not a perfect game, but it's a pretty charming one, I would say.
Compared to Sega GT, this is an absolute masterpiece. Put it that way.
That's absolutely true. So we'll get into the basic history of this title. So developed by the legendary AM2 studio and directed and produced by Yu Suzuki, who owned his own F355, and it's reckoned that he collected data from his own car to build the physics engine and sourced data from his friends who were also professional Ferrari Challenge competitors. And weirdly enough, it was published by Acclaim, which I have in my notes RIP next to, because Acclaim is no longer with us. It does kind of... It concerns me. I mean, maybe it says something about Sega's financial state at this time, that they had games that they developed on their systems that they could not publish. I mean, that seems kind of amazing to me. Like, that's not something that happens anymore. You don't see Gran Turismo published by Deep Silver. Like, no. That doesn't happen.
It just doesn't. It was a very weird time period, because I'm pretty sure Acclaim also published a port of Crazy Taxi on the PlayStation 2 as well.
They were responsible for a lot of Sega stuff, especially when they moved from first to third party. Very weird. I don't know why that's the case. I can only assume it's because of Sega's financial state. But so published by Acclaim, which I actually found out is this won't mean anything to you, but they're from Glen Cove, New York, or they were, which is right around the block from my childhood home in Long Island. So,
that's cool.
That was surprising. I didn't know about that. But anyway, so the arcade release was on that Naomi hardware we talked about earlier in the show. That was in July of 1999. It got ported to Dreamcast in the fall of 2000, retitled F355 Challenge Passione Rossa, and then came to PlayStation 2 in September of 2002 after Sega was no longer a first-party company and they started producing games for other platforms. So, yeah, you have about 2 years from the Dreamcast one to PS2 one, and they're almost exactly the same game. For a long time, I had and still have the Dreamcast one since the game came out. Me and my family had that title, and then within recent years, after years of trying to find this game on PS2, the PS2 version of it, and I talked a little bit about this on a previous version of Time Extend, I finally dug it up at the Retro Game Store not too long ago, and it was a big get for me, not because I expected the game to be significantly better or different in any way, but just because it's one of those things I wanted for so long, just because I looked for it and I couldn't find it. Even these PS2 games were basically being pretty much stripped from retailers in favor of PS3 and then PS4 and newer generations of hardware. So it's an interesting port for reasons I'll discuss later. But I think the best place to start with these discussions is just Brendan, because you're new to these games. For you, just give your overall outlook.
So I'm actually very impressed with the game manages to achieve by comparison to the other Dreamcast racers, because it is very much on the sim end of the spectrum, I would say. It's very difficult for someone who's not played it before to understand that behind the absolutely god-awful music, which we'll talk about in a bit, that there's a nice driving experience that includes like on-the-fly driving aids changes.
Oh, yeah.
Quite a nice selection of circuits. For example, you get Sugo in here, which is a track you don't see very often, and it's actually really fun. One of my favourites in Project Cars 2, funnily enough, so I was happy to see it here. Mm-hmm. And the championship mode is, once again, it's very challenging, because you actually see the AI cars kind of place in multiple places at the end of races, rather than just, there's a rabbit at the front. It's always the best. Yeah. You see the kind of pack mix up, and that's exciting, because like I won my championship without finishing first very often, and that's more like real racing, in the sense that unless there's a car out there that's much better than the rest, and because we've only got one car here, that can be the case. there's a lot of exciting racing, and the tracks are also recreated really well. They feel fun to drive on, and yeah, I would say initial impressions from the 5 or 6 hours I've put in is that it's probably one of the Dreamcast games that I've been shocked to find on the console, especially because I wasn't very familiar with the game in the first place.
Yeah, it's a... You start out by saying the game is hard, and it is very hard. Yeah, so Yu Suzuki basically, he doesn't consider this a video game. He considers it a racing simulator, full stop. And that's relevant for a number of reasons, one of which is that I believe I read a while ago that Rubens Barrichello had one of these in his home as a simulator for him to learn, because many of these tracks ended up, were on F1 calendars at the time, and I'll go through a track list right now. So the arcade version only had, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these, and they were Motegi, and it was just the oval version of Motegi. Suzuka East, Monza, which this is Monza from around 98, so it doesn't have the same first corner chicane complex that we know now. It kind of has those like two like kind of stair-step chicanes, which are significantly worse because 2 chicanes are worse than 1. Then it has Sugo, which is, like you were saying, a fantastic track. I love Sugo, especially a great track on the Super GT calendar. The full version of Suzuka, which they count as a separate track, and Long Beach, which is also in its 98 configuration. It's a good mix because you get some Japanese tracks, you get Monza, which is the hallowed grounds of Ferrari, and you get Long Beach, which is something that really the only series that ran there, I think, were pretty much like IndyCar / kart, and or one or the other, because they were kind of tied together, and whatever version of IMSA was around in the late 90s. But Long Beach is a really cool circuit. So those were the ones that came out when the original arcade release came out. But when they came out with the Dreamcast version, they added a bunch of exclusives. Atlanta, which is another oval, the Nürburgring GP course, Laguna Seca, Sepang, and Fiorano. And the interesting thing about Fiorano is that it's Ferrari's test course, and you could only, I think, do time trials there. You couldn't actually race there.
That's so typical of Ferrari video games, isn't it? For so long, they had those weird restrictions on what you could and couldn't do. Yeah,
and it's interesting, too, because we got, years later, like 10 years after us, we got a game from System 3 called Ferrari Challenge as well. That was a Ferrari Challenge Trofeo Pirelli. I think it also had Fiorano, and it might be a similar situation where you couldn't race there. But yeah, Ferrari, obviously, as we know, is very protective of their licenses. And, I think companies, just as a quick aside, I think if... maybe I'm projecting a little too much, but I think if some companies like Ferrari and, as we've been talking about in previous shows, Toyota, can tell that the developer, the publisher, is really earnest or really has like a trust for that entity, then they're willing to kind of play ball with them in a way. Like what I mean by that is like Toyota, right? Toyota's cars aren't in any games anymore, pretty much, except for Gran Turismo. But they're willing to do it for Gran Turismo because I think they've had a long relationship with Polyphony and with Kaz, and they trust them, and there's probably a little bit of like intra-Japanese, like, okay, we know you guys, you're one of us. And I think in a weird way, Ferrari and Sega actually share that relationship because Yu Suzuki obviously developed Outrun, and Outrun interestingly did not license the Ferrari Testarossa, but the Testarossa was already a famous car, but became an even more famous car because of Outrun, because Outrun was such a huge hit. And and obviously Yu Suzuki was a full-on Ferrari amateur driver and raced himself and owned an F355, so he was a customer. And I think there was no disputing that he had a genuine attachment and love and affinity for the brand, and I think Ferrari could see that, and I think that's where some of these stories come from. So just as a quick aside, like, I think that's the only way this game was allowed to be made. It only could have been done by Sega and probably by him. Yeah,
that would make sense, given like the the very strange scope of the game for only including this Ferrari specifically, and the track list, like we've talked about, it's so varied, and there's obviously some inclusions in there that were purely, I'm imagining, like you, Suzuki's favourite tracks as well, because it's weird to have Long Beach in there, like you were commenting on, Adam. And
yeah.
like, just, there's quite a few oval circuits, which is pretty odd.
Atlanta is a very strange one. I think these are tracks that the Ferrari Challenge Series went to, because if I'm not mistaken, a good number of them were in Trofeo Pirelli as well, and Atlanta might have been one of them. So, yeah, I think it just was trying to hit some of the places the series actually went to. But all of the tracks, the 6 originals as well as the ones that were added to Dreamcast and PS2 versions, made their way to another title in the arcades called F355 Challenge 2: International Course Edition, which is funny, one, because the first version had international courses, and two, it's not really a sequel. I mean, it's really more of a 1.5. It's the same game with more content. So that's kind of an interesting distinction there. Because when I initially read, like, oh, there's a Ferrari Challenge 2, I was amazed that this game got a sequel I never heard of, and then quickly discovered that it wasn't really a sequel. I think to talk about the physics, this is such a simple game in terms of you really do only get that one car. And you have a decent selection of tracks, but it's obviously just a simulator in the purest sense of the word. The physics have a lot to do with the success or failure of the game, depending on how you feel about it. And I think this is for the time, it's a very sound driving experience. Definitely harder than Gran Turismo was at the time, like even GT3, like without questioning. Sure. Not necessarily do I mean that means it's more realistic. It's just harder. Braking points in particular, you have to be very early on the brakes in this game, and that's a reason why I could not enjoy it at all when I was a kid. I would just miss every single braking point, and you really have to follow those boards, because if you don't, you'll be spinning out in the sand traps and whatnot. But braking, important. In terms of steering, it has this weird dichotomy where sometimes it's very responsive and sometimes it's so slow, and like the loss of grip is so like very slight, and carry that over a length of time to the point where you don't really even realize it's gone until it's gone, and you can't ever feel it coming back. So you just kind of do this like lazy slide in a lot of cases to the outside of the track, and then once you're on the grass, you're done. I mean, it's so hard to move when you're on the grass in this game.
I feel like Suzuka East kind of highlights that the most, because you've got all those S-bends, and like, if you miss the kind of apex from one of those corners, it's as if the car just decides, nope, you've messed up. Yeah.
When you mess up in this game, it's very hard to get back. Now, interestingly, if you turn traction control off and you get sideways, there is an element to, like, you can carry out a drift in this game. It's not like, because I feel like that's something that a lot of racing games from this time period really didn't allow, is like it's like, oh, you've lost traction, you're done. You can kind of dance on that edge, but there's just something weird about it. I just don't get the feedback that I do in a lot of other sim racers, including, Gran Turismo 3 and 4, where it's like I know where it's going and I can kind of counteract it. It's almost like you can tell it's happening, but you can't do anything to stop it. Like, to a certain extent, like I'm saying, like, you can drift a little bit, but like once it gets to a certain point, you're just like, I am basically a passenger at this point. And that's the way it's gonna be. It's very weird, and I'm sure the way we're describing it doesn't sound good, but it legitimately is an enjoyable driving experience. It's just a strange one, which is not at all weird for this time period, because obviously, now there are tons of sim racing games on consoles, but back then there weren't, and everybody was going at it from a very different way.
Yeah, definitely. I think the weird way of describing it would be like, it feels like it's a train on rails in the sense that you're a passenger, but the rails are going absolutely fucking everywhere. Like, there's no blockage to you drifting and stuff, but it's as if the game almost predetermines what the outcome will be sometimes, because the driving is good. That's the weird thing. We're trying to explain it here, and we might be making it sound bad, but it's a good, enjoyable driving experience. But it definitely has its issues with the feedback, like you were saying. There's pretty much none. It's a sim, and like this is a weird comparison. I don't know if you'll agree, but I feel like when you first turn it on, because you see there's one car and like 6 or so tracks off the bat before you unlock the other ones. It's not actually too unsimilar to like Sega's full arcade games. So when you turn it on and see that level of control that you've got over the cars is more similar to real life, it's pretty daunting. And I think that's one of the reasons why internally I keep mistaking it for an arcade game like mid-race. And as a result, that's why I don't hit the braking lines and stuff.
Yeah, it is really jarring because this game is very, very hard, and the championship mode is something I struggled with a lot. I think you're just a better driver than me in general, Brendan. That's why you're able to beat all the rounds of Sega Rally 2, and I think you're just better than me, which is fine. But no, I eventually was able to get down. I think at least, I forget how the championship progression works, because it's been a couple weeks since I played it, and my notes don't really... Oh, there's... Okay, so in the Dreamcast one, there's only one version, but I think in the PS2, there's easy, normal, and hard variants. Sometimes the championship isn't too bad. Other times it's... I think what it is in the Dreamcast one, once you complete the first year, you're on to a second, and I think that's where it gets a lot more difficult.
Yes, yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, so I struggled at that point, and... part of the issue with that is that the AI I don't have a serious problem with in this game, except for the fact that the collision detection is easily the worst part about this game. And when you hit another driver, very, very weird things happen. Like, it's impossible. Yep. It's almost like the game, like, it's almost like it wasn't programmed to, like, allow for collision. So when collisions do happen, it's basically just this kind of like unforeseen consequence of like this could play out in a number of ways, and the designers did not account for any of them. So at that point, you really are a passenger. But yeah, sometimes you'll hit cars and you'll just both go spearing off in different directions that are totally random. Sometimes you'll kind of get stuck inside of another car for a little bit, and you'll just kind of do this thing where like you're clacking against them and you bounce off of them back and forth. And then when you hit a wall, it's just as bad.
Oh, I was going to say about that, when you hit walls and stuff, like it's almost like a Lakitu effect from Mario Kart, where the car manages to spin on its axis, kind of direct you towards the road. It's a very weird, very jarring experience.
Yeah, very, very strange. But like we're saying, it's a quirky game in terms of its physics as well. But today we're so spoiled with all the sim racers we get that, our criticisms are more... honestly surprised that in spite of all of this, the game is still very, very fun to play. But something that I always thought was very interesting about this game, and it's something that bothered me a lot when I was a little kid, because the little kids are very superficial, is that there is no chase cam. And that was like the first half an hour of my gameplay, trying to figure out a way to change the cam. Yeah, I totally understand why, because... this is a simulator after all, and if you play the game in the arcades, or if you've ever seen the arcade cabinet of this game, it's got... some of the versions had 3 triple monitor setup. So, very ahead of its time in that sense. Now we've got all the full-on serious sim racers with their triple monitor cockpits and whatnot, but for Sega was doing this back in '99. And, yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised, but it did kind of bother me, because... it's also, you only get one view in this game, and it's a cockpit view, but it's that kind of, and this won't make sense to anybody who hasn't played these games, but it's that kind of Daytona 1 cockpit view where like you see like the upper 9th of the dashboard and the steering wheel, and you see hands. Well, I guess in Daytona you don't see hands, and you see part of the hood. But there's no windscreen. You don't feel like you're singing anything. It honestly feels like you're sitting in a bumper car, because that's in terms of the proportions, that's how small the cockpit is to the rest of the vehicle and your surroundings.
I was going to call it the soapbox view. That's what it reminds me of, like a soapbox racer, that type of thing. It's very weird and incredibly old-fashioned, and I think at the time it could have still been considered old-fashioned. I mean, we were starting to get like full real inside car kind of views at that point, because I'm pretty sure the Call of McKay games started to do that, didn't they?
Yeah, they did that on the PS2. Well, they did that actually on the PS1. Colin McRae 2 had a cockpit view. Yeah, that game was so ahead of its time. But yeah, so a couple weird things about it. Before we get off the physics discussion completely, when you were playing the game, I don't know how much you looked into it, but did you read about naso drifting at all?
I didn't actually. No.
Okay, so naso drifting is remember snaking in Mario Kart DS?
Yep.
Yeah, so naso drifting is kind of like that. So if you go on YouTube and you find some videos of really professional gamers playing the game who are very good at the game, there is this exploit where you can kind of dance on the edge of grip pretty much and literally just turn the wheel back and forth as quickly as possible. This is not at all a realistic drifting technique. It's purely just like lock to lock over and over again in the middle of a corner. And it helps you go through corners faster. It helps you go through corners faster than if you were just driving with a grip style or just, driving conventionally. It's very, very odd to watch. I'm not surprised that there is an exploit like that in this game because, again, for all the physics discussions that we've had about to this point, it is very weird. But as I'm playing the game, it's not something you can really do with the controller from what I understand. So I barely even attempted it. But the thing about it is that when you drift, you almost kind of like, it's weird, but when the revs pick up, like you kind of pick up speed when you drift a little bit in this game to a certain extent, and then you kind of lose it again. But I think that's why like these people are going back and forth very quickly on the steering wheel, and they're actually picking up speed rather than losing it, and they're able to drive really fast in that way. So it's very interesting. If you're interested in this game, I encourage you to go on YouTube if you haven't heard about it already, because it's a very odd thing to watch in motion.
I just want to know if that was a driving style Yu Suzuki deployed in his real racing career.
I highly doubt it, because if that was the case, he probably wouldn't be with us anymore. But thankfully he is, and he's making Shenmue 3. So, yeah. So yes, now we should talk about the soundtrack, which I think goes down as one of the worst in Sega's racing history.
I just sum it up in one sentence, basically. It's trying to be Guns N' Roses, and it's more like Swords and Tulips. It's just so. It's like one of those impression bands that play like really small bars and stuff, like tribute acts to like the 80s. It's just absolutely weird. I'm not sure what's going on. And I actually have a pretty funny story in the sense, like, at the start of races and stuff, I was sure I could hear like a voice really murmured in the background, like almost talking to me. Yeah. And I thought it was like a crew chief or something.
Yep.
And every time it would come on, I tried so hard to hear what the hell it was saying without like, changing the sound settings, and I couldn't make it out for the life of me. And then at one point, I managed to realise that it was a DJ.
Yes.
In a fucking circuit racing sim. What is going on?
Yep. So it's just such a weird, like, tonal disconnect between the serious nature of the game, and then you have like you have these like kind of fake Japanese Guns N' Roses songs, which I somehow know a lot about now that I've done research on the game. I'll get into in a second, but that, and then also you have these like kind of like Top Gun style guitar riffs that like take you in and out of menus and things in the game. Like it has this very 80s rock feel to it, but you're driving cars that were built in like the mid 90s, and this is a very modern experience with modern driving aids and modern circuits and whatnot. It makes no sense. I think Yu Suzuki at this point was just starting to become very, very nostalgic for a certain time of his life, and that's how this started. But so the soundtrack is super interesting because as I came to discover, there are two Japanese metal bands that are in this game. Two artists rather, and I have their names, and I don't know who they are, but I like to put names to these things. So, Genki Hitomi of the band Vow Wow, band I would not know, and you wouldn't either, and Minoru Nihara, and both of these men are apparently very accomplished metal, rock musicians in Japan, and we're big.
Take your word for it.
Yes, and we're big in the 80s, so their songs are in this game. That is somewhat interesting. What's more interesting than that is I did a ton of research on this DJ. Like, you have no idea, like, how much I was like how long I was sitting in front of a computer looking up information on this guy. And he is a real DJ, as it turns out. And his name is Alan J, which you can actually kind of hear him say that in the game. But his voice is, like you're saying, there are murmurs there, and it doesn't really make a whole ton of sense. His name is Alan J, and he has a brother apparently in Japan that is way more famous than he is, and his name is like Chris something. But yeah, so basically him and his brother are two Japanese American, well, I think they were born in America, or they were born in Hawaii or something like that, and they went to Japan and became DJs. So they can speak English, but they're also kind of like, I guess, spent most of their lives in Japan, which is why this guy has a very strange accent, and he's trying to affect some kind of like U.S. like American DJ, like rock 80s DJ voice, and it doesn't quite work. And I think that's why, because this guy has a very interesting mix of like an American accent mixed with a Japanese accent, and he spent all his life there. And he's still working today, as it turns out. He's still a DJ, and yeah, you can find out if you just do some light Google searching. You can find out all about DJ Alan J. Yeah, I don't know. I found this shocking, or not shocking, but just like really interesting that they got an actual DJ, and that I was able to find the guy and his basic history in a matter of like 2 hours.
I was going to ask, did you find out why he's in the game, or is that just one of those mysteries we'll never know? No, I didn't find out why he's in the game, and I don't think we'll ever know why he's in the game. It's so strange, like you're saying, it's the total tonal disconnect of a guy who's saying, no, this is a proper sim. Here's an American DJ introducing Japanese rock fans. It's
so weird, because it's weird for all the reasons we've discussed, but I think it's just really cool too. Like, now that I know who this guy is, it just gets me very excited. Like, to know that, I found his name. This is how obsessed I am with him. His name is Alan J. Pepler, and his brother's name is Chris Pepler. So actually, if you were to go on YouTube and you looked up, I think YouTube Live was doing some event in Japan or something like that. His brother is actually like the MC for the event. So that, I'll promise I'll stop talking about this now, but I was
going to say, is this the topic for the next mirror mode?
It might be. It might be. I'll just talk about, maybe I'll get an interview. That would be really cool. And ask
him on time extent.
Yeah, I'll ask this Alan dude if he remembers, getting paid for Ferrari F355 Challenge, and he probably won't, and I'll have to remind him and play voice clips, and he'll be like, that's strange. I must have been like high or something. So
it changed your life.
Yeah, exactly. Changed my life. I mean, the funny thing is, again, it's not a good soundtrack. The DJ doesn't belong there. It all sounds horrible, but it's in the game. And actually, if you go on YouTube and just listen to the soundtrack or find clips of the game, you will find a lot of commenters who really dig the soundtrack. And I kind of understand that, because as much as we don't like it, this is a sound that it's a type of music you would never ever hear in a video game.
Of course, yeah.
Especially a racing game. So, you think about the same type of people who played this as maybe enjoyed 18-wheeler Pro Trucker or whatever back in the day. That old Sega Racer, if you can call it a racing game. And yeah, I could see those people digging the soundtrack to this. If you liked 80s hair metal.
Yeah. So. I've just found out that Chris Pepler voiced Gus in Crazy Taxi.
Oh, that's totally believable.
Yeah.
Wow.
And he also did the commentary for Formula Championship Beyond the Limit from 1994, Sega CD game.
Wow.
That is pretty cool.
I don't know if this is going to matter to anybody else, but if I was a Time Extend listener, I would be feeling pretty proud of my host right now for doing all of this legwork for totally inconsequential shit.
That just kind of comes with the rights of being a Sega fan, though, doesn't it? Like, I feel like everybody who loves Sega has that in them, just like researching the most obscure stuff. Like, even when like YouTube was just starting off, I basically used it to watch like old Japanese adverts of like Sonic the Hedgehog and stuff, and it's like, why would I care about that? But that's just being a Sega fan as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, it really comes with the territory. I mean, I was astounded with myself when I revealed that Sega buried the Carlos Sainz losing the championship reference into their ads in Spain for Sega Rally 2. So I think this is just a continuation of that. But we'll stop talking about our new best friend Alan J and now briefly touch upon the PS2 version. Because I had the ability to play this game, and the differences are pretty small. You get all of the tracks that are in the Dreamcast version, the international course ones, at least the ones that came from the ones that are extras, kind of. You unlock them as you play the game, but in the PS2 version, they're there from the very start, which is nice because
Good idea.
Yeah, if I want to go Nürburgring, I shouldn't have to lose the championship 10 times before I have the ability to do that. But yeah. So that's nice. The graphics are an interesting point because and we haven't talked about the graphics of this game at all, but it's a pretty good looking game, and I mean it's not surprising, Sega, the first party title, would be good. I mean, we were surprised by how bad Sega GT looked. But this is definitely on another level, and I believe it's 60 frames, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah,
pretty
I believe
smooth.
So. And it's even got the Magic Weather system from Shenmue as well in here, which is really cool.
Oh yeah, and they call it Magic Weather too, which is pretty funny.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to get that name drop.
Yeah, all it really means is that the weather is dynamic and changes, but it doesn't change in the middle of a race. It just means that when you start the race, it might be different. It means you either will get rain or sunset or clear skies in the afternoon or whatever. But graphically, the PS2 version is interesting because it seems like the car models are a little more detailed. They have like reflections and things.
Yeah.
But they kind of look less accurate. It was almost like they went to the trouble of modeling more things, like the brake lights and things, but they got kind of the proportions wrong, so they look a little bit weird. Also, it kind of has this like soft sheen to it. As a Dreamcast fan, I always cling to this thing that like in the very early days of the PlayStation 2, its games pretty much looked worse than the Dreamcast's. And it took because the PS2 was a hard system to develop for, and like Ridge Racer 5 I think is still a pretty good looking game, but you get a lot of that like flickering and those jaggies on objects and things, and you get some of that in the PS2 version of F355 as well, because it was quite an early game in the system. Obviously, once developers had enough experience with it, they were able to blow Dreamcast stuff out of the water, but that came a couple years later. So that's interesting, but what's more interesting than that is they put in a chase cam, which is very, very, very nice. I appreciate that because it's tough with a game that's this difficult to really get a sense of your surroundings. I know it breaks the realism aspect of it, but the way the collision detection is in this game, you want a chase cam sometimes. Championship mode has, as I said earlier, easy, normal, and hard options, and there are different events too, so they kind of flesh that out a little bit. But the big addition to this, if you could really call the big addition, is something called the Great Driver Challenge, which I love because the way it's described, it's almost like it's basically like you would go into a typical race scenario, but you get points for things, and you could get points for overtakes and drifting and slipstreaming, and you get more points depending on your finishing position. But
so it's heart attack mode from Outrun then?
Yeah, kind of. Except no UFOs and no trying to collect hearts and things. But the funny thing is that the way it's described is it's Great Driver Challenge is here to teach you, quote, gentlemanly driving and technique.
Good old gentleman, was that?
Gentlemanly. Drive like a gentleman. Well, the funny thing is, like, yeah, if you pass someone without hitting them, or you get points for that. If you hit them, obviously you lose points. If you go off the track, if you put a tire off, you lose points, which is really unfair. But the weird thing is, if you drift, you gain a point. Now, in my opinion, there's nothing gentlemanly about drifting. Drifting is like the most like fucking Neanderthal like masculine thing that you can do. It's not,
But see, that's the thing. It isn't about driving gentlemanly, is it?
I like that we stumble through that word so much. You know what? I bet DJ Alan J can say that word really well, and we can't.
Exactly. But I like the idea of this mode, and I can also just imagine Yu Suzuki expressing his disappointment with a simple shake of the head every time we put a tyre off the track. But if we decide to be a hoonigan, we get that thumbs up of approval.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you think about how Outrun is basically entirely based on drifting, well, at least Outrun 2 anyway. So
yeah, he loves his drifting.
He does. So that really covers everything I had to share in my research on this Ferrari F355 challenge. And basically my lasting impression of it is it's kind of like a swan song for Sega Racing, because outside of Outrun 2, this is kind of the end. Like, this is, I have it down, like the first true Sega racer that made it to other consoles. And that kind of has it in this weird point between, like, Sega of old and the company they would become. And as I said, we only got Outrun 2 after this pretty much. So it's kind of like you can start to see things winding down. I don't know if anyone knew it at the time, but
yeah,
in retrospect, it definitely feels that way to me.
I think my final thoughts are very similar in that sense. And what I took away was, like, this was a glimpse of what could have been, where Sega were taking, like, their structure of arcade racers and trying to apply it to a more sim-like fashion, which was getting more popular. Like, can you imagine a game structured like Sega Rally, but with, like, Colin McRae's handling? Like, I wouldn't have been surprised to see Sega maybe give that a go, and that's what I get from this. Like, they were looking at the trends of Gran Turismo and that type of thing, and Yu Suzuki really loved his Ferrari, and this game came together, and who knows? I think that it's a fun game, and it is a bit of a swan song, but at the end of the day, it's another one of these Dreamcast games that makes you say, oh, if it had done a little bit more, it could have been better. But at the same time, I'm quite happy with the absolute craziness that it still has in terms of the soundtrack, because if it didn't have that, it might not feel as distinctly Sega as it should.
Definitely. I mean, can you imagine this handling model and this engine, but for Sega GT?
Oh man, that would be
that would have
fantastic.
Been like that would have been Gran Turismo 3 level. I mean, Gran Turismo 3 probably would have been better, but it would have been very comparable, and it would have at least made people who had Dreamcast not feel like they were getting shortchanged with their choice in system. And I feel like the Sega Racing System discussion always goes back to the fact that Sega's best work wasn't, at least in terms of racing games, was not done on this console. It was a home of a lot of weird ports of things that were great in the arcades, but never quite hit the home console with the same kind of just overall sense of quality. Whether you look at Daytona or Sega Rally or... I mean, F355, this is a very faithful port because, like I said, it was running on Naomi, and Naomi is essentially, I think it's like a Dreamcast with more RAM or something like that. So it's basically the same system, but at the same time, F355 is a very singular experience. It's a very basic experience, and it feels like a very old school game in spite of what was at the time a very advanced handling model. So yeah, there's always something you can point to, right? With all these Dreamcast games where you're like, if they just did this, they would have gotten it right. And the more I think back on it, the more I think that, like, the only The only time that Sega came out with a racer on a home console that was, at least in my lifetime, that truly delivered on everything it was supposed to and was just like the most you could have hoped for at the time was a Saturn port of Sega Rally.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think you've summed it up very well there, because if you look at Sega Rally 2 and the Dreamcast, we talked about how the initial conversation started with us saying how much we enjoyed it, and then it did kind of hit home that the Dreamcast effect of, but it doesn't have this, it runs pretty poorly if you open your eyes, try not to blinker it out, and yeah, it's a bit damning that we always do end up back at this point, but at the same time, I think that's why it was a great console to start off with, because it highlights why the console failed as well. It just didn't have that killer app, and racing games were very much Sega's bread and butter for so long, but there's always something missing.
It's a company, I think, caught in the middle of a changing landscape, and Sega I think really did earnestly try a change with the Dreamcast. And if you just take the view of the company overall, they definitely changed a lot from what they did with the Saturn in terms of the way they designed the system and their marketing and everything, and that's all great. But when it comes to racing fans like us, the world had moved on. I mean, Gran Turismo, sim racing, these huge experiences with way more cars and tracks and different modes and customization, that was the future. And as much as I love Sega's arcade racers and as great as the physics are, having one car and 6 tracks or 10 cars and 10 tracks, like that wasn't where things were headed. Things, yeah. You know, they really struggled by not having something that could seriously compete with Gran Turismo, or at least not having it sooner in the system's lifespan, albeit it was very short as it was. And yeah, I think we're just reminded of that every time we do one of these very, very enlightening and very exciting, but also slightly tinge of sadness Sega Racing System episodes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the good thing is now we're slowly whittling down the games till we get to MSR on, which I know are two that you're very excited to talk about.
So I spent a ridiculous amount of time on Friday for some reason playing Vanishing Point. Like, do you?
I seen you talking about this. Yeah, I actually played quite a bit of Vanishing Point on the PlayStation 1.
Oh, so we can have a really good discussion about it then. You might not even need to buy the game, because I can just talk about the Dreamcast one, and you could talk about the PS1. But yeah, I mean,
that's a good dynamic.
Yeah, that works well for you. Yeah, no, that's another very strange game, and I'm not going to spoil or get into that, because we should really be ending the show now. But once I start talking about this stuff, I really can't stop, and that's why we have a podcast. But yeah, we're getting to a point now where we've touched on a lot of the Sega one, like the Sega first-party Dreamcast racers, and we can start to talk about some of the third-party stuff, which in a lot of ways is actually more interesting. Because these weren't just arcade titles that were ported, they were totally their own thing. And then once we get to the best game ever made in the history of the world, Test Drive Le Mans, that might be a good place to end it.
I mean, speaking of Le Mans, I've just had a quick look on eBay, and there's actually finally a reasonably priced copy, but the interesting thing about it is that it's a pre-production sample disc. So Whoa. It's a review copy of the game for $12.95.
Oh, you gotta get that. Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's cool.
Oh, that'd be awesome. And like stream the whole thing, because I want to watch it just for myself and see if anything's different.
Yeah, exactly. That's what about. It's like the other full-fledged copy on eBay still like £45. This seems like a steal. So, yep, just bought it right then and there. So that would be very exciting.
Great. All right, so we know what the next episode's going to be then. Well, this was awesome. I always enjoy these discussions, and I love being able to dig up some dirt on weird old games that nobody remembers. It's always fun. Alan J. I think that's going to be our second guest. Is going to be Alan J. You know, we started off strong with Kyle last episode, but
yeah, we need to ask him about V-Rally 4 as well. I had to get that reference in, man. We nearly forgot.
Oh, right, yeah. I'm sure he has a lot to say about V. I got so confused just now. I was like, what?
Well,
all right.
I mean, we couldn't have done a full episode without a V-Rally reference, surely, so had to sneak that in.
We almost got through it. And, yeah, so I guess the appropriate sign off would be that I hope all of you enjoy V-Rally 4 in between now and our next episode, where we won't be talking about except to make some throwaway joke.
Yeah, enjoy the masterpiece before we talk about Le Mans, which clearly doesn't even compare to V-Rally 4. Am I right, Adam?
Hey,
Does that hurt to say?
You take that back. I fucking love that game so much. All right. So that has been Time Extend, and we will see you one day talking about Test Drive Le Mans. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.